This is First National Bank of Lindsay, Oklahoma, and on Friday, this little bank failed and was taken into receivership by the FDIC. Except instead of being treated as too big to fail, this story is being treated as too small to care by both the government and the press. Reporting on this story has been incomplete and in some cases outright lazy and is missing some very important details that warrant discussion, debate, and coverage. First is a matter of fairness. Billionaires and venture capitalists and big tech firms are being given special preferential treatment in Silicon Valley and Wall Street, while small businesses in flyover country are not getting that same consideration. And that's something that was predicted by a senator from Oklahoma a year ago, almost to a T. And the second important facet of this story is a story about greed and corruption coming in all shapes and sizes. Now, the big Wall Street and Silicon Valley scams always get the most attention when billions of dollars go missing, but that doesn't mean fraud doesn't run rampant in small-town America. And in the case of this little bank, tens of millions of dollars has gone missing, presumably stolen. One man is dead, and it's all happening in a small town where money has a funny habit of turning up missing. And as always, the small, poorest residents of the town are usually left holding the bag. What's up, guys? I'm Nobody Special, and once again, on a Friday afternoon, we got the news dump of a bank failure. It's not because banks fail on Fridays, it's because the government tells us about bank failures on Fridays when we're all distracted by the beginning of our weekend, so hopefully very few people notice. But this one happened in the sleepy town of Lindsay, Oklahoma. First Bank and Trust Company of Duncan, Oklahoma acquires the insured deposits of the First National Bank of Lindsay, Oklahoma. The First National Bank of Lindsay was closed by the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, which then appointed the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation as the receiver. To protect depositors, the FDIC entered into a purchase and assumption agreement with First Bank and Trust of Duncan, Oklahoma, to assume the insured deposits of First National Bank of Lindsay. So first, let's get the fear-mongering thing out of the way. If you are an insured depositor, meaning you had less than $250,000 in any account in this bank, you are fine. You were previously a First National Bank customer. Now you are a First Bank and Trust of Duncan customer. The First Bank and Trust of Duncan will take over this one branch little bank. It opened as usual this morning. No insured depositors lost any money at this bank. Now, part of the reason why you probably haven't heard anything about this story is because this was a very tiny bank. As of June 30th, 2024, First National Bank of Lindsay reported total assets of $107.8 million and total deposits or liabilities of $97.5 million. Approximately $7.1 million of the deposits exceeded the FDIC insurance limits. That amount is likely to change once the FDIC obtains additional information from customers. So this is a very small bank, guys, $107.8 million, nowhere near the size of the banks that failed last year, like Silicon Valley or Signature or First Republic Bank. This bank is actually closer in size to something like the Heartland Tri-State Bank that failed in Kansas last year as the result of a pig butchering scam and embezzlement by the CEO. Now, there's one very unique thing about this story that sets it apart from all the banks that failed last year, and that's in this paragraph here. In addition, based on the estimated recoveries of the failed bank assets, the FDIC will make 50% of uninsured funds available to those depositors on Monday, October 21st, 2024. This amount could increase as the FDIC sells the assets of the failed bank. So at every bank that failed since last March, everybody got everything back. The deposit insurance fund made whole everybody, even those uninsured depositors who were above the $250,000 threshold of the FDIC insurance. But in this case, we've actually got some uninsured depositors losing money in this case. They're losing 50 cents on the dollar, so they're still getting something back. But this is the first time anyone at a small bank has lost money due to a bank failure since the start of the crisis last year. Now, the FDIC preliminarily estimates that the failure will cost its deposit insurance fund about $43 million. That may not seem like a huge amount, especially in the context of the banks that failed last year. But keep in mind, guys, this was a really small bank. $107 million in assets, $97 million in liabilities and deposits, yet they lost $43 million. That is a huge percentage. This is nothing like Silicon Valley and Signature Bank, although some other channels in finance are out there saying, hey, this is a continuation of the crisis from last year. This is definitely not the case. This is a case of fraud very similar to that Heartland Tri-State Bank that failed in Kansas. And they actually mention it in the next sentence there. The estimate will change over time as assets are sold. Alleged fraud caused the failure of the bank and cost to the DIF. Now put a pin in that fraud. We'll be back to that in a second. For the moment, though, I want to talk about the uninsured depositors losing money. Because in every bank that's failed up until this point, everybody got everything back. They used something called the systemic risk exception. They basically declared banks too big to fail, and therefore, if uninsured depositors at, say, Silicon Valley Bank in California lost too much money, it might be a systemic risk to the whole economy. And so it was of vital importance that those people didn't lose any money. But in this case, 50% of the money is being lost by uninsured depositors at this bank in Oklahoma. But it wasn't just the big Silicon Valley banks that were declared too big to fail. Even as recently as this year, Republic First Bank in Pennsylvania was declared too big to fail, and uninsured depositors got everything back. And even Heartland Tri-State Bank, which only had $113 million in assets, they were declared a systemic risk exception, in other words, too big to fail, and uninsured depositors there got everything back. But in this case, this little bank in Lindsay, Oklahoma is being declared too small to care, and so we're not going to bail out the uninsured depositors here. They're going to lose money. And it makes you wonder, what is the threshold that the government is using here? They're arbitrarily picking winners and losers. Why is this bank in Oklahoma not a systemic risk when a nearly identical bank that failed for a nearly identical reason in Kansas was declared too big to fail? It seems a little arbitrary. And as it turns out, this very issue was raised by a senator from this state. Oklahoma Senator James Lankford raised this very question with Janet Yellen at a Senate hearing last year. Let's listen to that clip.
Will the deposits in every community bank in Oklahoma, regardless of their size, be fully insured now? Are they fully recovered? Every bank, every community bank in Oklahoma, regardless of the size of the deposit, will they get the same treatment that SVBP just got or Signature Bank just got?
A bank only gets that treatment if a majority of the FDIC board, a supermajority of the Fed board, and I, in consultation with the president, determine that the failure to protect uninsured depositors would create systemic risk and significant economic and financial consequences.
So what is
and
your
we
plan?
made that determination.
Right. So what is your plan to keep large depositors from moving their funds out of community banks into the big banks? We have seen the mergers of banks over the past decade. I'm concerned you're about to accelerate that by encouraging anyone who has a large deposit in a community bank to say, we're not going to make you whole, but if you go to one of our preferred banks, we will make you whole at that point.
Look, I mean, that's certainly not something that we're encouraging.
That is happening right now.
That is happening because depositors are concerned about the bank failures that have happened and whether or not other banks could also
No,
fail.
it's happening
And
because you're fully insured no matter what the amount is. If you're in a big bank, you're not fully insured if you're in a community bank.
Well, you're not fully insured.
So in that clip, Senator Lankford from Oklahoma rather correctly points out that, hey, Secretary Yellen, when you guarantee the uninsured deposits at the big banks, but not at the little banks, you are by default creating a free incentive for customers to go to those big banks where they get free guarantees from the U.S. government, free insurance on their deposits, and they're taking risk if they leave the money in the small rural banks. Well, that is exactly what happened in this case. In the very state represented by Senator Lankford here, he predicted this exact outcome. And Secretary Yellen tried to explain it away by saying, in consultation with the president and the FDIC, if we deem a systemic risk, all this other stuff, basically saying the big banks on the coasts are more important than little banks in your state. And so we'll bail out venture capitalists and big tech companies in Silicon Valley. We'll bail out people with a lot of money in the big banks in New York and Pennsylvania. but we just don't care about the banks in flyover country. That's the message that Yellen sent. So in arbitrarily picking winners and losers like this, what Secretary Yellen and the FDIC have done is they have created an incentive to pull money from the uninsured deposits at small banks and put them into the perceived safety at big banks where they get the free guarantee from the government. They could be creating a run on small rural banks by doing this, and Senator Lankford was calling that out, saying that's not fair, and it's also reckless because it's going to lead to a consolidation in the banking industry, and it's going to lead to the collapse of a lot of smaller banks. Now, I'm also not suggesting that this bank should have been bailed out, because I don't think this bank should have been bailed out. The government can't guarantee all deposits at all banks, not without printing massive quantities of money leading to widespread inflation. But at the very least, it seems we have a very flawed method for determining which banks are too big to fail. And it seems you're too big to fail based on your geography, who represents you, what favors are owed, who you play golf with, more so than whether or not you actually represent a systemic risk to the economy. Now, the other unique thing about this story is something that the press is not telling you, something that nobody is covering, and that is the history of money going missing and suspected corruption in the town of Lindsay that actually goes back years. Now, whenever I investigate a bank failure, I usually start with the players involved. Who is the CEO? Who's on the board of directors? And what is being said on social media about this bank? That led me to start here at the Facebook page for the First National Bank of Lindsay. And it was in scrolling through the history of this bank on Facebook when this story took a little bit of a dark turn. I came across this letter that was published on the Facebook page on September 29th of 2024, addressing the unexpected passing of somebody who worked on the bank. We at First National Bank of Lindsay are heartbroken by the devastating and unexpected loss of Clint Simonton. And it turns out Clint Simonton wasn't just another bank employee. He was actually the number 3 man at the bank. He was the vice president. And it was the phrasing about his unexpected passing and some of the wording in his obituary that led me to believe that his death was not an accident. And I've been able to confirm with several Lindsay residents that Clint Simonton took his own life on September 27th, 2024. Now, even though the bank didn't fail until October 18th, whatever investigations were going on at the bank obviously were happening over the days and weeks before that. So it's reasonable to assume that whatever was happening at the bank may have played a role in Clint Simonton's suicide. And I've also learned that a few days before Clint Simonton took his own life, this man, Danny Seibel, the CEO of the bank, was fired and escorted out. He was the number 2 man at First National Bank of Lindsay. And of course, that leaves the number 1 man at the bank, this guy, Jack Justice, who is the owner. Now, at this bank, somewhere along the way, we had the $43 million hit to the deposit insurance fund. You had about $10 million worth of equity in the bank went up in smoke, and about $3.5 million of uninsured deposits were lost. That means this is actually close to about $60 million went missing at this bank. One of these 3 guys knew what was going on there, and the fact that one of them took his own life in the days leading up to the failure obviously raises a lot of suspicions. Now, I just want to point out that nothing is known at this time. There are only allegations of fraud. Nobody has been arrested to my knowledge, and nobody has been charged with any crimes. Now, when I see a bank failing because of fraud, and I see the press overlooking the suicide of an executive at that bank, I decided to go to the best available source to find out what is going on in this small town, Karen's on Facebook. And in the local Facebook pages, I found an entire pattern of money going missing in this tiny little town going back years. Starting with this article here, City of Lindsay facing bleak financial outlook. It turns out in 2020, inexplicably, the city manager, who's now the mayor of Lindsay, fired the town's auditor. No reasoning was given. There's been all kinds of accusations and denials in the town about what actually happened. All we know is without any reason given, they let their auditor go. And then 2 years later, $1.1 million was missing from the town's finances. And like is always the case, whenever greedy people either mismanage, lose, or outright embezzle and steal money, it's the poorest among us who are always forced to foot the bill, which led to this article just a few weeks later in 2022. Lindsay raises utility rates and fires the city manager. In order to make up that $1.1 million shortfall in the town budget, electric and water rates were raised for the entire city. Now, this was initially sold as if, it's only going to be a couple of dollar charge on your bill. But shortly after this story broke, residents started complaining that their utility bills were doubling or in some cases even tripling from the highest number they had ever seen. And a lot of people in these Facebook groups were expressing their frustration, saying they're leaving the town, they can no longer afford to live there. Somebody either lost or stole $1 million from the town finances, and everybody in town had to pay the price. And now, well, tens of millions of dollars has gone missing at the local bank. Maybe it's time somebody take a look at the finances in this town. And according to my sources on the ground in Lindsay, that is exactly what's going on. The town is actually being audited by the state legal office. I did find this article from back in 2021 with the town was considering their options for an audit. The debate was over whether or not they would hire a private auditing firm to rectify the books or whether they would go to the state investigator's office, which has more of a focus on whether crimes were committed. And my sources tell me they went with the state investigator's office, and that report is actually due out very soon. And I'm also just finding out that the town of Lindsay has now called an emergency meeting for today at 6 p.m. Central Time. No reason was given, but it is highly likely that this emergency meeting has something to do with the bank. My sources tell me the town had municipal accounts with this bank, and in the days prior to the bank's failure, money was being moved around. Now, that's information I'm unable to confirm, but if that's the case, did the people in the town municipal government have advance notice of the problems at the bank, and did they move their money to safety while withholding that information from private citizens who are now losing 50 cents on the dollar because of their uninsured deposits, which raises more ethical and legal questions about how this is being handled. By the way, the city of Lindsay has a YouTube channel and they are supposed to live stream their videos. If there is a link available to that emergency meeting being streamed, I will put it in the comments down below. So long story short, this little bank in this little town with this little sign that laughably reads fraud protection failed because of fraud, it appears. Tens of millions of dollars went missing. The government, after spending all last year bailing out Wall Street and Silicon Valley banks, has decided the small businesses in this town are not worthy of that bailout, arbitrarily so, something that Oklahoma's senator warned about a year ago, which raises all kinds of ethical and legal questions about how these determinations are being made. And buried in this story is the appearance of a pattern of fraud dating back several years in a town that has been struggling with money going missing, with corruption, and now somebody at this bank has stolen so much money that the American taxpayers and the Deposit Insurance Fund are on the hook, which means those losses are being socialized across everybody who does business at any bank in the United States. These are not victimless crimes, folks. This is innocent people whose lives are being made more expensive after years of inflation that made life unbearable for a lot of people, are being asked to foot the bill for somebody who is stealing millions of dollars in a town where it looks like this has been going on for years and nobody cares because, well, it's just this little town nobody's ever heard of, and corruption is so common in our society now that we've all just come to accept it. It's not supposed to work this way. Maybe now that tens of millions of dollars has gone missing, somebody in the state or county government or even federal investigators are going to look closely at what happened here. Maybe that stolen money can be recovered, and the people in this town who saw their utility bills triple, or the people who lost their money at this bank, might be able to recover some of those losses. And to the people in the town of Lindsay, I have read the messages in your Facebook group. I see how people are trying to hide behind this family's grief in order to suppress anyone talking about what's going on, either in your municipal government or at this bank, while you guys are being forced to foot the bill for somebody who's out there living the high life at your expense. If you have information related to what's going on at this bank or what's going on in this town, you can find my email address on the About Me page of this channel, or you can reach out to me on Twitter at JGNuke. I would be happy to talk and hear what's going on in this town, because somebody has to. Nobody is speaking up for the people in this town who are being bled dry. Everybody is hush-hush. Nobody wants to make any waves. Don't expect anything to change as long as that's the case. Till next time, live small and dream big.